I know I'm going to catch some flack for this video, and that's okay. If you're enjoying Stalker 2, that's great. I hope you continue to enjoy the game and have a good time. I'm not going to try and stop you, and I don't want to. But this video needs to be made. It has been a little over 2 months since the release of Stalker 2 Heart of Chornobyl, and it's released to a mostly positive reception and now sits at a very positive review score on Steam. However, with glaring issues and in many cases game-breaking bugs being present at launch, many fans of the game were quick to put the game down or just completely refund it. In the following weeks, GSC has released patch after patch, fixing many of the big issues the game had at launch, including a large number of bug fixes, balancing changes, and quest/progression fixes, with the latest patches coming out that begin to address the problem of A-Life, but more on that later. Despite all these fixes though, the game still has a large number of core problems that need discussing. My main critique with Stalker 2 is that at the game's core, at its foundation, it is an oversimplified and shallow experience. If the game was a different IP and not in the Stalker universe, I would have lost interest in this game a long time ago due to the simplified mechanics, cut content and features, the empty and shallow open world experience, and the arcade game style progression system, with terrible balancing both for the player and the enemies. Furthermore, Stalker 2 fails to build on the core mechanics of the franchise, building and developing on them, and instead feels like a simplified, cut-down version of the original games with just a fresh coat of paint. It doesn't even manage to be a satisfying open-world survival game. The open world feels like an empty husk in the majority of locations and doesn't live up to its potential at all. The weapons are horrifically unbalanced, the loot is incredibly simplistic, and any level of loot scarcity is a complete and utter joke. The game's economy and reward system is unbalanced, mutants are more of an annoyance than actually rewarding enemies to fight, human enemies are gigantic bullet sponges once you're in the late game even with the best weapons, A-Life is still broken despite the updates, the performance is terrible, and the graphics and visuals are disappointing in a lot of circumstances. To say that I had high expectations going into Stalker 2 would be an understatement. A sequel to the original trilogy 14 years later, this game should have been damn near perfect, but it's not. In fact, it's far from it. Stalker 2 is not a good open world FPS game. It's actually a pretty bad one. Before this video gets the usual comment of, Stalker 2 is just like the old games, you just don't like Stalker. I do like the Stalker series, I've played the original trilogy, I've sunk countless hours into Anomaly and Gamma. They are great games, and the Stalker lore and world is so complex and well written, and the possibilities are endless. But I'm looking at the old games through the lens that those games were made from 2007 to 2010. The standards for what constituted a good game were vastly different back then. For context, Shadow of Chernobyl released in the same year alongside the first Assassin's Creed, Halo 3, God of War 2, and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Times have changed and I hold Stalker 2 to a much higher standard. Not only is it 2025, but Stalker 2 is the price of a AAA game title at $60, triple the price of its predecessors. And it should be held to the same level of scrutiny that I would hold any game that costs that much money. Now before we get too far into the video, there is an important question that needs answering. What makes a good sequel? It's a simple yet complex question that will have different people giving you different answers. Is a sequel good because it does everything the same as the previous games? Or is a sequel good because it takes what made the previous games good and builds on it, expanding and innovating on what made its predecessors great? I'd argue that both of these can be correct, but I'd lean towards the latter in terms of defining what makes a good sequel. Some sequels are successful because they keep the core mechanics and gameplay systems the same from game to game, Call of Duty being an example of this. A sequel that keeps what made the first games great and then building on it and making it better is what separates a good sequel from a great sequel. I'm thinking of the Ezio trilogy and Assassin's Creed, or God of War 2018 and Ragnarok as more recent examples of this being the case. Ragnarok took everything that made 2018 great and turned it up to 11, with more combat mechanics, more armor and weapon abilities, more upgrades and customization, more side content, better visuals and graphics, better animations, new gameplay and puzzle mechanics, more complex puzzles, new enemy types and overhauls to existing enemies. Everything, except the shield combat, still sad about that, was improved in a way that stayed true to the previous game and still felt like God of War. There's some issues with the writing and pacing of the game, but Ragnarok mechanically is what a truly good sequel should strive to be. As I will explain in this video, Stalker 2 is not this type of sequel. The mechanics and gameplay systems are almost exactly the same as they were in Call of Pripyat, with little to no development or innovation made in the time between. There are very few new gameplay mechanics that play any meaningful role in the gameplay loop, and that begs the question, does that make Stalker 2 a good sequel? Well, that depends on how you view the old games in the series. If you loved Call of Pripyat, you'll most likely enjoy Stalker 2 as well, but the fact that in the 14 years of time between the games, My expectations were for the basic gameplay mechanics to be vastly expanded upon, and with many more new mechanics and systems to be implemented. And yes, you can do this in a way that still feels like Stalker and stays true to the original games. Just because you have some expanded mechanics and maybe a couple of new ones that innovate on the previous games, it doesn't suddenly mean that it's not Stalker anymore or that it's just a completely different game. Will GSC fix the issues I address in this video? Most likely some of them will be fixed in the coming months, but then again, maybe not. This trend in the modern gaming industry of releasing buggy and unfinished games and promising to fix them later is only becoming more common, and so many fans are glazing over this issue, saying something along the lines of, well, the original games were buggy and unfinished, we don't expect Stalker 2 to be any different. It's a common response I see to fans with this complaint, and if you think that way, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. It's not an excuse to get away with charging full price for a game only to release it when it clearly needed another year or two of development time at the minimum. I have no doubt that GSC is working hard to fix the game's issues and release patches and hotfixes, but it's clear that the game wasn't ready when it launched. In its current state, the game feels more like an early access version of the final game, and if it had launched that way, I wouldn't be making this video. But the game was released at full price and with very little transparency from the devs about the state of the game. I do believe that in 2 to 3 years, with consistent updates and some must-have mods, Stalker 2 will be an amazing game and possibly one of my favourite games of all time. And that begs the question, why am I even making this video? I'm making this video with the aim to provide constructive criticism and feedback about the game in its current state, not thinking about what the game could be or just hoping that these issues get fixed on their own, because unless fans of the game push back, provide criticism and ask for these issues to be fixed, well, they just won't be. Let's start off with what I like in the game. The story and main questline in Stalker 2 is everything you would expect and want from a Stalker sequel. I'll avoid any major spoilers for those who have not yet played the game or finished the story yet, but the plot of the game is well written with engaging quests and new characters, along with many returning ones from the original trilogy. The majority of the main missions are fun to play and focus around the various factions in the zone, both old and new. In my opinion, the main questline from Stalker is everything you would look for in a sequel to the original games. The story focuses on our new main protagonist, Skiff, a Ukrainian ex-military operative whose home outside the zone gets destroyed by what appears to be an emission, and he finds a mysterious artifact in his laundry basket of all places. He aims to gain access to the zone to uncover the secrets of the artifact and get answers and also compensation for the damage he's endured. Things go sideways pretty quickly, and the game's story unfolds from there. Let's quickly discuss narratives and characters in RPG games. And yes, I do consider Stalker 2 to be an RPG, sort of. Stalker has always been a blend of FPS survival horror with RPG elements scattered in for good measure, and Stalker 2 is no different. You have multiple story endings, dialogue options, critical choices that influence the outcome of the story and major conflicts between groups and factions in the zone. These are all elements that are typical of RPG games. And while Stalker 2 doesn't have the classic RPG mechanics like XP leveling and skill trees, opting for a more gear-based progression system instead, it's still enough for me to consider Stalker 2 to be a light RPG. With all that being said, let's talk about how to narratively set up a role-playing game. LazerzZ does a much better job explaining this than me in his Assassin's Creed Odyssey video, which I've shamelessly stolen the title of. I'll link his video in the description down below. I'd highly recommend you give it a watch to see what I'm talking about, but carrying on. Firstly, you need a character. You need someone or something to roleplay as, and there's a few ways you can do this. You can take the Bethesda approach and give the player a completely blank character. You decide everything. You choose what your character looks like, you choose their name, their race, their height and weight, starting skills, etc. All the dialogue options are not your character speaking, they're you speaking. Your character has no core character traits because you are the character. The core character traits are the traits that you have, not the player character. You can pick and choose dialogue options to be either nice, mean, humorous or sarcastic, and you get to choose the emotional direction of each encounter based on what you yourself would pick, or what kind of character you have decided you want to roleplay as, whether that's a good or bad person, or maybe something in between. The other way is the Witcher approach. In the Witcher games, you play as Geralt, a pre-established character with a set appearance, voice, and set of core character traits. When playing the games, you are playing as Geralt. Everything you do is Geralt doing it. You still have dialogue options and make your own choices, but they all feel like Geralt, and the dialogue has been written in such a way that aligns with his core character traits. Geralt is a Witcher. He's a mutated monster hunter. He's shunned and ostracized by most people he encounters, so he can be incredibly stern and harsh to people he meets, as a reflection of how he's been treated, but he also has a softer side brought out by those closest to him, like Yennefer, Vesemir, and Ciri. When playing The Witcher, you can choose to help people who are less fortunate purely out of the goodness of your heart. That's Geralt. Or you can do it purely for financial gain and nothing else. That's still Geralt. The characters and dialogue have been written in a way that allows the player to make their own way through the game and make their own choices, while still staying true to their pre-established characters. Now, something you should never do is combine these two approaches, because if you do, you get a pre-established character with no core character traits that pivots between being a good or bad character on a whim, a character that you yourself have not created, but who also isn't a pre-established character and doesn't have any core character traits. And that's who Skiff is. When playing Stalker 2, I couldn't identify any of Skiff's core character traits. Yeah, he's ex-military, he's well versed with weapons and combat, but beyond that, what kind of person is he? Well, that depends on what you choose for him to be. You could choose to be a good man, sparing those that you encounter and choosing to help out people during side quests and Radiant activities, or you can choose to be a cold-blooded killer who murders almost everyone he meets. You can choose to help a stalker recover the body of his dead friend and want no reward at all, but you can also choose to steal their stuff and shoot him in the face. These dialogue choices are inconsistent and don't adhere to any core character traits because Skiff doesn't have any. No time was spent to build him up as a character, and because the majority of the game's main interactions are dialogue choices, no real character development can be done either without the choices making any sense at all. Skiff isn't a character, he's this weird mix of a blank character and a pre-established one. His core character traits are based entirely on your choices throughout the game, and when those choices can be wildly erratic, you fail to build any foundation of a character. If you're going to go with a pre-established character with a backstory and motivations, the writing needs to be done to actually establish that character and give the players options and narrative justification. World exploration is a key part of the Stalker series, with Stalker 2 taking this concept to the next level with a completely seamless open world combining all the zones from the original games into one connected area for us to explore. And a world to explore needs a justification for exploring it, a reason in the narrative or the character as to why they are doing what they're doing in the open world. This is usually quite a difficult task to overcome from a writing perspective, especially when the main plot of the game is a fairly linear questline, but doing the extra work to give your character a reason that fits the narrative or the character as to why they are exploring this open world space can really enhance not only the exploration, but also the character development as well. Days Gone from 2019 does a perfect job of giving us both a character and narrative justification for the open world exploration. In Days Gone, you play as Deacon, a drifter who does jobs for the various camps around the open world area. This is how Deacon survives, by handing in bounties and completing tasks for the camps in return for camp credits to buy supplies with, similar to the side quests in Stalker 2 for the various factions in game. With Deacon's backstory and character development, it's shown that he has a deep hatred for the Freaks, Rippers and Marauders, giving not only the player but Deacon himself a justification for exploring the map and clearing out Ripper camps, destroying hordes, and doing a lot of the side content activities while also exploring the open world space. It's not simply there for the sake of filler in the game, but the writers made Deacon's core character traits and development align in such a way that it makes sense for him to be doing these side activities, in addition to helping out the friendly encampments. Granted that Days Gone is not an RPG game and doesn't have a dialogue system like Stalker 2 does, all the dialogue is set and you simply guide Deacon through the game's story, but Stalker 2 does not give Skiff as a character a good justification as to why he should explore the zone, or really even care about what happens to it. The player might care about the zone and want to explore, but no groundwork has been done to establish why Skiff himself would want to explore anywhere in the zone that's not his main objective, which is getting his home back. Ask yourself this the next time you go out exploring in the zone. Why would Skiff actually do this? Why does he care about this? Does he have any motivation or reason for exploring these areas? Spending days and days doing nothing that's at all related to the entire reason for him being here, which is to find who's responsible for his home being destroyed and get compensation for it. No groundwork has been done in the early game writing to establish any motivation or reasoning for the exploration in Stalker 2. Skiff himself isn't a stalker. The usual motivations for exploring the zone, like hunting artifacts, doing jobs and tasks for finding loot, don't apply to him because that's not the reason for him being here, and he's not shown to be interested in any of those activities. I won't go too much more into detail about the game's story, firstly because the game hasn't been out for that long and I don't want to give any spoilers for the game or its endings. One of the only other issues I do have with the game's story progression, and I'll avoid any spoilers again for those who have yet to beat the game, but a large amount of the endgame items such as weapon attachments, blueprints and armor sets are located in Pripyat, the endgame location in Stalker 2. More specifically, they are located past a point of no return in the game's storyline, meaning that to obtain those items you need to lock yourself in until you beat the game. However, once you beat the game, you have no option to return to the open world, so these items that you obtain are only usable for maybe a couple of hours while you beat the final missions, and then that's it. They're unobtainable anywhere else in the game. It makes me wonder why this decision was made in this way to lock endgame items behind a point of no return with no other way of obtaining them. This is something that should be changed. A potential fix would be once the game is beaten, the player is sent back to before the point of no return, but these final endgame items are kept in the player's inventory. They would have to do the final missions again to beat the game, but they could keep the items and continue to use them whilst exploring the open world. The open world in Stalker 2 is one of the game's biggest selling points and will ultimately tip the scales for me to buy this game. Having the zone we all know and love reimagined into one open world playground for us to explore sounded amazing, and GSC delivered. At least I thought they did during my first few hours in the game. The open world is huge, and when I say huge, I mean gigantic. The map in Stalker 2 is approximately 64 square kilometers, with every single zone from the original games seamlessly put together and redesigned by hand. I spent hours and hours in my playthrough just walking around and exploring the world, from the creepy swamps in the south all the way to the radar installation in Duga, and even to the Red Forest and Pripyat, which look better than ever before. I think I can say with confidence that Stalker 2's open world is one of the best world designs ever put to screen. I haven't seen a world this well put together and meticulously crafted since I played Elden Ring for the first time. The attention to detail in many of the locations that are scarily accurate to real life locations in the Chernobyl exclusion zone shows how much effort was put into crafting this world by hand. Once I got to Pripyat, I compared many of the locations to real life photos, and the likeness was astounding, with buildings and monuments modelled one to one, even down to the position of some tables and chairs in some places, making the world of Stalker 2 feel very grounded in reality despite its supernatural setting. The problems start when trying to find anything to actually do in this amazing world that's been crafted. Part of this video is to do with A-Life's current state, which I'll discuss later in the video, but most of this issue is how empty the world feels in the vast majority of locations. So many locations and points of interest on the map have literally nothing there except maybe a couple of crates of loose loot that you've seen 100 times before. You might find the occasional PDA with a chat log from a couple of stalkers, but besides that you find nothing of any real substance. A few locations have some interesting unique weapons or a set of armor or maybe a weapon attachment, but that's all there is. There's nothing here in any of these locations, barely any NPCs, and the ones you do find have nothing to say to you. Only a pre-recorded set of answers to Skiff's favourite question, what's new around the zone. Even the original games had more dialogue options than this, allowing you to ask questions about where to find work, or survival tips, hunting for artifacts, or even questions related to certain quests that you have active. After my first couple of hours of playing, I quickly realised no one has anything to say or any level of interaction at all beyond a single line of dialogue if they're not an important character or a trader. I quickly found myself completely ignoring most NPCs I came across, since most of them won't say anything to you, just telling you to speak to their boss or their commanding officer. Without any worthwhile NPC interactions, the locations in Stalker 2 feel lifeless and robotic. There is no reason to interact with any NPCs that aren't traders or quest NPCs. There is no value or immersion to be gained by doing this, so even when I come across a new location and see that there is freedom there, or duty, or loners, my reaction is the same. Guess there's some people here, moving on. I don't have any curiosity to interact with these NPCs because I know there is no interaction to be had. I know there's nothing they can tell me that's of any value, no quests they can give me, no backstory or lore about the area, there's nothing. Skiff might as well be invisible to them. This deterioration of the open world experience becomes more and more apparent the further away you go from the starting zone of Zalicia. My first few hours in Stalker 2 exploring the lesser zone and then the slag heap in garbage were great. I was having a blast going to every nook and cranny to see what I could find. But in the later zones of the game, to the north and to the west, there is just less and less content in the game to where it gets to a bare minimum to be considered worth exploring in my opinion. The majority of my exploration in these later zones was done purely out of curiosity and for the sake of this review, and I was disappointed 9 times out of 10 with what I found. Once you get fairly far into the game, the only reason to go out exploring new locations in the zone is to hunt down blueprints and stashes to unlock some final gear upgrades and hunt artifacts. What doesn't help either is that any element of visual storytelling is lost on the average player who cannot read Ukrainian. I'm sure you've seen the plethora of messages written on walls or on road signs in the open world that you cannot read, with no option in game to translate it. And it turns out many of these messages are nice little pieces of lore that flesh out the world, or even worse, actual clues to puzzles or hidden loot rooms. The fact that there's no way in game to read these messages deprives 90% of the player base from interacting with this part of the world. Luke Stevens on YouTube designed a test to see how interesting an open world is in a given video game. I'll link his full video in the description, but the test essentially goes like this. Mark a location in your map for a quest or point of interest, play the game for an hour, and see how long it takes for you to get distracted by something in the open world. The shorter time it takes to be drawn in or distracted by something off your chosen path, the more interesting the open world is. I tried this in Stalker 2, starting in Zalicia and setting my map marker for Forester's Lookout in the Red Forest. I had a couple points of interest draw me in, mostly because of the A-Life system spawned a few bandits here and there to take pot shots at me, so I cleared them out and explored the area to loot them. But after the hours and hours I've spent in the game previously, I had no desire to actually explore anywhere, because I already knew what would be there, which is really not a lot. Some medkits to add to my already overflowing stash of medkits, more bread and sausages and ammo that I don't need, a weapon attachment that I can just fast travel to a vendor and buy instead. There isn't anything worth seeking out in the open world. The only thing that comes to mind is armor sets, but once you progress moderately through the story, the vast majority of armor you find is worse than your current suit in every way, and only worth picking up to sell off to a vendor. I know it's a custom feature in Anomaly and Gamma, but I do miss the disguise system from those games, being able to wear an enemy faction's armor and blend in with them. It gives you a reason to keep and maintain an armor set from each faction, and this would have been a great feature to have included in Stalker 2. There is little to no incentive to explore anywhere in Stalker 2, other than sheer curiosity about the location, or just for the sake of completion. And so, I didn't. I just ran in a straight line to my quest objective, chugging energy drinks every 100 meters because Skiff has the stamina of a 5-year-old. I just ploughed my way forwards. The world in Stalker 2 feels as vast as an ocean and as deep as a puddle. And for a world that's clearly been very well thought out and carefully crafted over years and years, it's just such a shame for there to be so little in it of any real substance. The only places of any real interest are the NPC hubs in the game, since they're the only locations where any meaningful interactions can be had between you and the world. Something I miss from the old Stalker games, which I think is a real shame not to be in Stalker 2, is the PDA guide, with lore tabs and archives to read up on the various locations, anomalies, mutants, and factions. These were great to read in the other Stalker games to immerse yourself in the world, the factions, and the mutants in the zone. With a large number of Stalker 2 players not having played the original games, this guide being absent from the game means the player doesn't really get told or shown much about the world or anything in it, which is a pity because Stalker has always had a very rich and deep lore surrounding the zone and all of those within it. It's not shown to us in any meaningful way in Stalker 2, and I cannot wrap my head around why this wasn't included in the game. Some simple flavor text about the locations and the mutants would have sufficed. Hell, I'd have been happy if they just literally copy and pasted it from Shadow of Chernobyl. There was clearly a more advanced PDA in development. Keen-eyed fans spotted that NPC PDAs have more tabs than the players, with an archives tab and statistics tab, so this clearly was in the works at some point or another. And speaking of the PDA, we have a severely stripped down PDA in Stalker 2 compared to the previous entries in this series, especially Shadow of Chernobyl. No guide or archive tabs, no player statistics, no leaderboards, no global PDA chat, no messages logs. These were great features from the previous games, and there's no reason at all to be cutting features from a game made 17 years ago, especially when they were well-loved features in the first game. I loved the whole leaderboard and reputation system from Shadow of Chernobyl, seeing where you rank against other stalkers in the zone and slowly climbing the ranks yourself, chasing the #1 spot, was a really cool mechanic and made the zone feel much more alive because the other stalkers were actually real entities in the zone. If you found the #1 stalker and took him out, bam, now the leaderboard has changed and you've climbed up the ranks. This feature being absent in Stalker 2 doesn't surprise me because the zone isn't alive. There's nothing happening in the world outside of the A-Life spawn bubble that surrounds the player. There are no other stalkers to speak to in the zone. Overall, the world in Stalker 2 is beautiful, and it's clearly been crafted and built with extreme care and attention to detail, and it's a great foundation for an immersive survival experience, but it doesn't feel finished in any sense of the word. There's a lot more work to be done here in terms of fleshing out the world and populating it with side content and other interactions for the player to experience, because as it stands right now, I just can't see it. Okay, let's take a break from the world design and story narratives and talk about the graphics. At a standstill, Stalker 2 is a breathtakingly beautiful game. I find myself often pausing in many locations just to admire the surroundings and atmosphere that this game produces. Whether it's hiding in a building from an emission with the only light being the deep orange glow illuminating the environment, or whether it's admiring a sunrise from a high-rise rooftop somewhere, Stalker 2 has the ability to produce some gorgeous looking visuals. The problems with Stalker 2's visuals start to emerge when you actually start moving. One of the big visual issues in Stalker 2 and seemingly every other game made with Unreal Engine 5 is TAA. I won't go into all the details of why TAA is so terrible in this video, but I may explore it in a future one. The TLDR is that TAA is a method of anti-aliasing used in most modern game titles and results in significant blurring and loss of detail, especially at medium to long distances. Threat Interactive has a great video on YouTube explaining why TAA is so bad and dives into the fake optimization going on with video games today. I'll link their video in the description as well if you are interested. This gives most games with TAA the effect of smudging butter all over your screen and then playing the game. When stationary, this effect disappears since the whole temporal part of TAA isn't doing anything, but when moving around the environments in Stalker 2, the effect is immediate and my god, it looks appalling. And there is no option to turn it off or use a more legacy form of anti-aliasing such as SMAA or MSAA, which on a high enough resolution look perfectly acceptable. Stalker 2 also has some pretty major issues with VRAM and memory management, to the point of being essentially unplayable on a video card with 6 gigs of VRAM or less without mods. I noticed in my 60 hours of playtime almost constant flickering textures in buildings and flora and vegetation in the open world. There also still seems to be some major issues with the texture LODs, causing pop-ins most noticeable with trees and vegetation, even when playing the game at maximum settings. These issues with the textures, the popping in trees and bushes when exploring the zones severely detracts from the graphical potential and beauty of this game. These issues aren't game breaking by any means, but it does break any level of immersion in the game, and these issues that need addressing for the majority of players. A big part of the problem with the visual quality of Stalker 2 ties into its performance and optimization, as even on my rig running a 3080 Ti laptop edition with 16 gigs of VRAM, I still had to play the game at less than 1080p upscaled to 1440, with frame generation on just to achieve a semi-stable 70 to 80 FPS at medium settings. Playing at such a low native resolution and with frame gen on leads to a lot of visual artifacting and blurriness, holding back the potentially stunning visual quality this game could provide, and my god, I can't even express properly how bad this game feels to play with frame gen turned on. Even on my system, I still needed frame gen to be running either through the in-game option of FSR or using a third-party program like lossless scaling. In Stalker 2 though, using either of these options creates so much input lag, it feels like I'm wading through waist-deep mud trying to play this game. All of the actions feel sluggish, the combat feels awful with such high input lag, making your aiming inaccurate. If you cannot run this game reliably without frame gen, just save your money and don't buy it until the optimization issues are fixed. The fact that Stalker 2 runs so poorly even when using upscaling methods like frame generation is a complete joke and proof that GSC did next to no work on optimizing this game before its release. Comparing Stalker 2 to other titles that look the same or better, they run better, and don't use any of the upscaling methods, TAA or frame generation, you can see how bad the optimization is in Stalker 2. Going back and playing older shooter games from the past decade like Far Cry 4 and 5, Dying Light, Doom Eternal, The Division 2 and Days Gone, I'd argue that these games visually look essentially on par with Stalker 2 or at least get very close, and I have no issues running any of them on my system, and that's with no upscaling or frame generation needed at all. It shows how bad the current state of optimization is in the video games industry. We've hit a point of stagnancy in the gaming world in terms of graphics, where most new games that are released aren't leaps and bounds ahead of projects released multiple years previously. I think graphics peaked around 2016 to 2018 and haven't substantially improved since. Even with improvements made to consoles and PC hardware, games releasing today are arguably looking worse than games released 5 to 10 years ago, and yet they run worse and have a higher spec requirement, and Stalker 2 is no exception to this. Stalker 2 uses Unreal Engine 5's Lumen lighting technology, opting to use this method of software-based lighting rendering instead of opting for the more traditional ray tracing hardware rendering. Unfortunately, the implementation of Lumen in Stalker 2 could be done a lot better, and this is less so a GSC development problem and more so a problem with Unreal Engine itself. Software-only Lumen illumination is performance hungry and produces mostly good results, but those results are subject to visual errors and artifacts that produce some pretty bad looking visuals in some cases, particularly with reflections. You often get this grainy and blurred reflection which just looks terrible if we're being honest here. Transitions from interiors to exteriors and vice versa are also handled poorly with the current lighting model, creating a harsh transition when exiting or entering buildings, where exteriors are suddenly much darker than they appear from within a building, or if you're inside a building the outside light feels way too bright. Stalker 2 not having dynamic lighting in any form, unlike the earlier entries in the series, is a baffling decision and can only be because dynamic light sources are incompatible with Lumen in some way. I really miss the flashlight shadows and dynamic lighting from the older Stalker games, and not including it in Stalker 2 seems like a big step backwards, especially when half this game is at nighttime or indoors in dimly lit areas where you need your flashlight. It's an issue which shouldn't be in a game released almost a decade and a half later. Whenever I play Stalker 2, I keep thinking back to playing Stalker Anomaly and Gamma and how good those games look. Now don't get me wrong, they don't look as good as Stalker 2, but it's an important comparison to draw because Anomaly and especially Gamma are essentially the pinnacle of what could be visually achieved through the X-Ray engine. There are many occasions when playing Gamma where I think to myself, this game could be released as a AAA title today and I would not be disappointed with the graphics. Sure, the character models show their age and CPU optimization could be better, but the fact that you can get such stunning looking visuals on an almost 18-year-old game engine, with no frame generation, no TAA bullshit, no AI upscaling is truly remarkable and begs the question of what exactly is going wrong with modern day game development practices. Overall, Stalker 2 can be a great looking game some of the time, and a terrible looking game at other times. The interior environments look amazing, but many of the exterior environments, I just cannot say that they look good when there are so many texture pop-ins, problems with LODs loading incorrectly, and flickering vegetation due to how Lumen works in outdoor environments, paired with the poor performance in most areas of the game, alongside the issues with frame generation and ghosting, all lead to a blurry mess of an experience if you're running this game on anything but the best hardware money can buy. I will say the atmospherics in this game are phenomenal, and you can have some really awesome moments where everything comes together and works properly in that special way, and you think, yeah, this is what I've been waiting for, this is Stalker 2. But you'll have just as many moments, if not more, where the graphics and visuals leave so much more to be desired. Performance and optimization in video games is a tricky subject to cover, because to some degree, at least on PC, it's subjective depending on the hardware you have. If you have a maxed out PC rig with an i9 and a 4090, you'll likely not encounter any real performance issues in any game you play, whereas if you have a more budget setup, performance and optimization suddenly becomes more important. With that being said, for context, I record all my footage on my laptop, which is a Razer Blade with an i7-12800H, 32 gigs of RAM and a 3080 Ti laptop edition with 16 gigs of VRAM. This setup, while not perfect, still allows me to max out most of the games I play at 1440p while achieving a stable 60 FPS in most cases. The performance in Stalker 2 is not good. I think everyone can agree on that across the board. No matter what system you have, the performance in this game is below average in comparison to most other games that have a similar level of graphical quality. The worst performance issues I encountered, apart from general lack of any stable FPS regardless of what settings I used, was stuttering. A large amount of stuttering occurring very often as I travelled throughout the zone, and from my experience in testing, most of this stuttering is related to NPC functions. More specifically, NPCs spawning in and rendering in for the player, with the more NPCs being visible or rendered at once, the worse the performance is. This, at least for me, is what made most of the NPC hubs in this game almost unplayable, with FPS dropping below 20 in Rostock, Yaniv and Zalicia. The smaller NPC hubs were a little bit better, still hovering around the 30 FPS mark. Keep in mind I have the game at medium settings, besides the textures which are set to high. This is with DLSS set to balanced and frame generation off. The performance hit seems to be because Stalker 2, much like its predecessors, is extremely CPU limited, a common problem with Unreal Engine 5 games, but since all the NPC behaviour is handled on the CPU, a large number of NPCs on screen at once just causes your CPU to basically fry itself. And the trouble is that I'm not entirely sure how this issue is going to be fixed, without just simplifying the NPC behaviour even more than it already is, or just removing non-essential NPCs from the game hub areas. When exploring the open world, NPCs that get spawned in with A-Life don't impact performance too much, but the small stutter when they do spawn in is still noticeable to me. It's clear to me that the developers cut corners on optimization either to save money or just to get the game released on time. I don't have too much more to say about the performance in Stalker 2, and this script is long enough as it is. I'm sure with more updates and fixes in the future the performance will improve, but with current CPU limitations my expectations are that these improvements won't be too dramatic, and especially if A-Life is actually fixed and working properly, as in NPC behaviour is being tracked and processed for all AI over the zone no matter where you are, the performance impact of that happening will be gigantic, and not in a good way. If the game struggles to handle just 20 to 30 NPCs at once, it will not be able to handle possibly hundreds of NPCs all at once, all over the zone. This is actually my leading theory as to why A-Life is working the way it is currently. Some data miners have already shown that the game does have A-Life functions in the code, they just aren't working right now or are bugged in some way. And I suspect that this is because in testing, the game ran so poorly with A-Life properly enabled across the whole zone that it was stripped down to what we have now just to be able to release this game in a somewhat playable state. Now for arguably my biggest complaint with Stalker 2, and that's the weapons in the game. The weapons in Stalker 2 are lackluster in their implementation, how they are balanced in the game, their availability, and their customization options. I will say that the animations for the weapons are spectacular, on par with Escape from Tarkov, if not even better. The animation team has outdone themselves, and I commend them for their work. Starting with weapon variety and customization, Stalker 2 doesn't have many guns at all in the base game. Mods and DLC will increase this number, I am sure, but the base game, excluding unique weapon variants, 11 of which are deluxe edition / pre-order bonuses and therefore not available in the base version of the game. Stalker 2 has 35 weapons for you to choose from, 33 excluding the Gauss rifle and the RPG, which have 0 level of customization or upgrade options, but don't let this number fool you. For reference, Call of Pripyat, released in 2010, had a total of 33 weapons, so Stalker 2, released 14 years later, is barely an improvement in weapon variety, and also removed fan favourite weapons like the AN-94, the L-85, LR-300 and F-2000. Weapons in Stalker 2 are distributed around the map in the different zones, with more difficult zones having a chance to reward you with higher tier weapons. It makes sense, right? But the problem emerges when the majority of enemies you fight are using the exact same guns in almost every single fight. The amount of AK-74Us and AK-S74s I've picked up from bandits and soldiers is crazy, and once you pick up a couple of guns, you never even need to check what weapon an enemy is carrying. Take assault rifles for example. There are 9 assault rifles in Stalker 2, the AK-74U, the AK-S74, the Fort 221, the Dnipro, the AR-416, the GP-37, the Karod, the Groza and the S.T.A.L.K.E.R. At first glance, this seems like a great selection of assault rifles, however in practice the enemies you face throughout the entire game only carry about half of these weapons. In the 60 hours of time I've logged in Stalker 2, I've never seen any enemy stalkers carrying the higher tier guns like the Karod, the S.T.A.L.K.E.R or the Dnipro in any location other than Pripyat. This means that the weapon variety on the vast majority of NPCs is extremely limited and rarely makes it worthwhile to pick up NPC weapons or even check what they're carrying. Furthermore, since NPC weapons never spawn with any attachments, this only further compounds the problem. Instead of checking NPCs' guns for red dots, scopes, suppressors, or maybe that rare extended mag you've been searching for, there's nothing. And since most enemy weapons you find are on red or yellow durability, it doesn't even make sense weight-wise to pick them up and sell off later, unless you're someone who likes looting every single thing that's not nailed down. The way that weapons are balanced in Stalker 2 only makes the issue of weapon variety more apparent. Weapon balance in Stalker 2 can be seen as breaking the weapons down into 3 tiers of weapons: early, mid, and late game guns. What this does from a weapon stats point of view is giving guns arbitrarily better stats than others for no logical reason at all. Taking assault rifles again, say you want to run a 5.56 gun for a little while as you've built up a stockpile of ammo. You're fairly far into the game, so you have all 3 options available to you of either using the AR-416, the GP-37, or the Karod. In this scenario, the Karod is really your only option as both the AR and GP-37 have significantly less armor penetration, particularly in the later game zones where almost every enemy is wearing an exosuit and is a complete bullet sponge. Armor penetration quickly becomes the most important stat in the entire game. So, using the AR-416 or the GP-37 puts you at a steep disadvantage. All this despite the fact that they all use the same caliber ammunition and in real life have similar ballistics capabilities. This way of balancing the game's weapons severely restricts the player's choice unless they want to deliberately put themselves at a disadvantage. So, if you want to use 5.56, your options have gone from 3 down to 1 realistic option to use once you're over halfway through the game. And this is the case for every single ammo caliber. There is no variety without disadvantage. The weapons should be balanced around other stats like range, rate of fire, attachment compatibility, durability, etc., rather than just altering the raw damage and penetration stats without any good justification as to why these stats are different. This is a horrendous way of balancing weapons in a game that is using close to real life firearms. This isn't Destiny or Borderlands where weapons can be vastly different because of fantasy reasons. These are real guns with real ballistics, and even in a game like Stalker, they should be balanced around that. Another example of this issue is with the pistols in the game. Skiff's starting pistol, a basic Makarov PM shooting 9x18, sports better damage and penetration than both the USP, the regular PM Makarov, and the 9mm pistols. This again makes no sense from a balancing perspective, since there is almost no scenario where 9x18 produces better ballistics results compared to a round like 45 ACP. Because of this, there is almost no reason to use the other pistols in the game other than wanting a different looking gun. 9x18 is the cheapest and most accessible ammo in the game, so the fact that it deals better damage and armor penetration than many other calibers makes no sense at all and shows the level of thought that went into the weapon balancing in this game. And the Bucket S2 SMG and the ASPB make a complete and utter mockery of the weapon balancing in this game, dealing more damage and significantly more armor penetration than the AR-416 and both of the AKs. So in this world, I guess 9x18 outperforms 5.56 in every single way. And speaking of calibers, 7.62x39 is basically a useless round in Stalker 2. The only guns chambered in it is the Dnipro when upgraded with a blueprint, and the RPM-74, aka the PKM, which was never actually chambered in 7.62x39, instead using the much more damaging 7.62x54R round like the SVD and SVU used in Stalker 2. And stranger still, in the previous Stalker games such as Call as Pripyat, the PKM does use 7.62x54 PP ammunition, so this caliber change is just one I cannot wrap my head around. The PKM itself is kind of a meh gun in Stalker 2. It has good damage, but with limited attachment availability, a heavy weight, and a very lengthy reload time, it almost never makes sense to carry this gun or pick up any 7.62x39 ammo you come across. For a round that was so commonly produced in the Soviet Union and with so many guns chambered in it, it's so confusing why the PKM is the only gun in this game chambered to use it natively. There could have been a basic AK-47, SKS, AK-103 or 104, the 7.62x39 variant of the Groza, the RPD, the RPK. I could go on and on, but this particular caliber feels very underwhelming and underutilized in Stalker 2. The weapon attachment system has good animations and the attachments are very functional. However, the attachment compatibility is extremely confusing and just downright incorrect in so many cases. This is particularly apparent with the unique weapon variants in the game. So many attachments in this game are not compatible with weapons that in real life they are compatible with. The easiest example of this is the multitude of scopes and sights that can be attached to a Picatinny rail on some guns, but not on others, despite the rail system being explicitly designed to allow for more compatibility between weapon attachments in real life. Or for the unique weapon variants that have custom optics or come with a suppressor or extended mag. Firstly, there is no option to change or remove the optics on these guns. Why not? Are the attachments welded in place or something? And secondly, in many cases you can't use those same attachments on another gun of the same kind and essentially build the weapon variant yourself. An example of this being the small red dot sight on the soft mod variant of the AR-416, or the long range scope on the clusterfuck. I get that this incentivizes the use of these variant weapons and makes them feel unique, but it makes no sense from a logical gameplay perspective. The attachment system and weapon customization in Stalker 2 is extremely limited, with each weapon only having one compatible suppressor, a small handful of optics options, and one extended magazine option. This doesn't feel like a lot of customization options and is barely an improvement over the weapons in the original trilogy. When upgrading a weapon at a technician, there is a few additional customization options, such as adding a foregrip, laser designator, or flash hider / compensator to weapons. However, the laser designator doesn't actually work and looks downright horrendous when playing the game with frame generation and upscaling turned on, so I opted just to not use that upgrade at all on any of my weapons. Plus, there's no option or keybind toggle to turn it on or off. You're stuck with the laser on all of the time. For a game with the amount of weapons that Stalker 2 has, I would have definitely liked to have seen more customization options and upgrade paths for the weapons in the game, similar to the upgrade system in Call of Duty or Delta Force for example. With customizable stocks, pistol grips, handguards and barrels, this would give each weapon in the game a much larger amount of customization options and would make up for the limited number of weapons in the base game. Is there anything directly wrong with the current way the weapon customization works? Well, no, but it's got the potential to be so much more than what we currently have. Take the basic AR-416. You could choose to mod it in such a way where it basically becomes a DMR like the clusterfuck, opting to use a longer barrel and handguard with a long range scope, or you could go completely the other way and shorten the barrel right down, opt for a compensator for more recoil control, and stick with a basic red dot to handle those close quarter encounters. And you can see the devs toying with this idea in the weapon variants like the clusterfuck, which functions exactly like a DMR with a long range scope, higher damage and single fire only. It's a cool weapon and easily one of the best in the game until the late game, except for the mind-bogglingly high repair cost and weapon degradation, but that's a separate issue. It just seems like wasted potential to limit the customization options so much with the current weapons. I'm not talking about going to the extreme end like Escape from Tarkov does, but something a little more in-depth than the current system would be nice to see. I'm sure that these issues will be fixed either by mods or by the dev team directly, but it's strange for this not to be the case in the base game, and it doesn't feel like any of the weapon mechanics from the original trilogy were expanded on or developed further at all. Comparing Stalker 2 with the previous entry in the series, Call of Pripyat, there is zero improvement or development in any of the weapon mechanics. Weapons can attach optics and suppressors, just like in Call of Pripyat. Weapons have durability and can misfire or jam, just like in Call of Pripyat. Weapons and armor have upgrade paths that increase their stats, just like in Call of Pripyat. No effort has been made to improve the weapon mechanics or add more depth to them in Stalker 2, and whilst there's nothing wrong with the weapon mechanics, the choices feel very limited, and for a game 14 years later, I was expecting to see so much more. Let's talk loot. Loot is a big part of the Stalker series. While it might not share much in common with games like Destiny or The Division, I'd still consider the Stalker games to be looter shooters in a sense. You loot, and then you shoot, and then you loot some more, and repeat. Loot is an important part of Stalker 2, and having good loot variety and scarcity is crucial to having a good experience in a looter shooter. Stalker 2 has neither good loot variety nor loot scarcity. The loot variety in Stalker 2 can be broken down as follows. You have consumables, ammunition, armor, and weapons. Consumables consist of medical items and food, with each being varied enough to fulfill the basic requirements of the game, but still feel very limited. The problem comes with the scarcity of these items in the zone. Loot in Stalker 2 is plentiful, and that's not a good thing. You find an enormous number of consumables and ammunition in the game, arguably too much. For the sake of this review, I started a brand new game on Stalker difficulty, and after about 30 minutes of exploring the Lesser Zone after the prologue sequence ends and you're tasked to head to Cilicia, I had over 20 medkits, almost 30 bandages, enough vodka to keep Skiff drunk for days, radiation medicine, bread and sausages galore. It honestly surprised me to have so much loot so early into the game, and the loot is so plentiful that you never have to worry about not having enough. In my main playthrough save, I went back to check my stash before entering Pripyat and the final missions, and I had almost 150 medkits sitting in my stash. An important part of any survival game, especially survival shooters, is to craft a fine balance between having enough resources in the game to keep you afloat and not having enough to still make the game challenging. It's what makes the game difficult. Should I take this firefight or not? Because I only have so many medkits and so much ammo. This fight could reward me with some great loot, but at what cost to my own supplies? It's simple supply and demand. In Stalker 2, I never even considered whether or not to take a firefight, or even to take the fight very carefully, because I had such an abundant supply of healing items and ammunition that there was essentially no risk to me. Because I knew that no matter what happened, I could just back off, pop one of my 30 medkits in my inventory, and instantly be back at full HP and in the fight again within seconds. It felt more like I was playing Doom than Stalker. Medical supplies should be much rarer in a game marketed as a hardcore and immersive survival game. Medical supplies would be considered almost priceless items in the zone, so how come I find so many in every single location I visit? Have no other stalkers checked this little shack outside of Cilicia except for me? Am I supposed to believe that as a player exploring these areas? I often found myself deliberately putting medkits and healing items into my stash, or just selling them to traders just to feel like the items were a little scarcer and an actually valuable resource, only carrying 5 medkits in my inventory at any time so that I had to think carefully about when to use them, only to wind up an hour later with another 30 of them in my stash. The different types of medkits in game also offer little if any proper bonuses. I'm talking about the army and scientific medkits here. The basic medkit already restores about 80% of your health almost instantly. It's not instant, but by the time the short little injector animation has finished playing and you re-equip your weapon, the health restoration is pretty much finished. The army and scientific medkits restore more health, but the basic one already restores so much and does so quickly. I never actually used these upgraded medkits because I never felt the legitimate need to in even the most difficult combat sections of the game. The medkits, in my opinion, need to be rebalanced to function less like an instant heal and instead be a heal over time item, with the basic medkit still restoring a lot of health but doing so very slowly over the course of maybe 15 to 20 seconds, and the army and scientific medkits shortening this time down significantly to where the scientific medkit restores your health over the course of 3 or 5 seconds. This would provide a better incentive to hold on to a couple of these medkits in your inventory to use during an oh shit moment in combat, because in the current balance of the game, the medkits we have now make the game woefully easy even when playing on veteran difficulty and robs the game of any real combat challenge. And this describes 95% of the loot you will find in Stalker 2. The other 5% is weapon attachments, which are useful in upgrading and customizing your guns, but these attachments are few and far between, meaning in the majority of cases you're much better off just buying the ones you need from the traders in the zone. You can also find blueprint thumb drives, which unlock certain upgrades for specific weapons and armor. Again, very useful if you're looking to spec out that armor suit you're rocking, but these blueprints are very rare to find, and oftentimes the upgrade that is unlocked isn't that amazing or game changing for the armor or weapon. The only ones I'd consider worth searching for are the blueprints that add more artifact pouches or lead containers to your armor, and the blueprints which allow you to change the caliber on your weapon. Speaking of artifacts, since they are technically lootable items in the game, the artifact hunting in Stalker 2 is the best the series has seen yet, hands down. I'd go as far to say it's the most fun activity in the game for me, and it's a very visually satisfying experience with the reworked anomalies, and the new models for the artifacts and their inspect animations are fantastic. And diving into anomaly fields with your shiny new detector, searching for that rare legendary artifact is a really fun experience. It's just a shame the artifacts don't have much monetary value in the game, but I do like collecting them in my stash and finding good combinations to use with my current build. Lastly, we need to talk about stashes. Stashes in Stalker are one of the main ways you get loot. You can find a stash marked on your map, and it's usually a small hidden loot container that contains some valuable items. The stashes in Stalker 2 have some of the worst loot content and variety in any looter shooter game I've ever played. It's just disappointing. Apart from some notable marked stashes like the journalist stashes, the regular stashes in the zone contain a few consumable items and some ammunition. Again, you might find a rare weapon attachment in a few static locations around the map, or a specific blueprint thumb drive, but the majority of stashes just contain a few rounds of ammo, some medkits and some food, which is basically every lootable item in the game. The stash system in Stalker works by marking stashes on your map whenever you pick up PDAs, finish quests, or talk to NPCs. Although it definitely feels like some stashes just randomly appear on my map as well. I'm not sure if this is intended or not, I'd likely say this is a bug of some sort. Each stash is given a random name and a small description, which almost never correlates with the actual loot in the stash, which is either static loot for certain items like attachments and blueprints, or just random loot. I've seen so many stashes with the description, "This is my life's savings, don't touch it," only to find the stash and it contains like 3 pieces of bread, a medkit, and 14 bullets for my AK. It just makes zero sense, at least throw some valuable loot in there. Overall, the loot in Stalker 2 feels half-baked and underwhelming in the vast majority of cases. There's a couple moments where you can find some really awesome loot like the unique weapon variants or a sick suit of armor. I still remember finding my first Siva suit and was so hyped to finally have a good suit of armor to wear, but the majority of loot you find is not even going to register in your brain when you pick it up. Most of the time when looting stashes, you just press R to take all and then sell everything off to vendors. It feels like the loot system is in an early access build of a game. Hopefully in the future there will be more loot variety added to the game. I sure hope so, because right now the looting system in Stalker 2 is a big letdown for me. Stalker 2 does in fact have some survival mechanics, the usual hunger, thirst and fatigue meters that you see in most survival games, requiring the player to carry supplies and take actions to keep their character healthy. Stalker 2 also includes a radiation meter that you have to keep in check, using either vodka or anti-radiation medicine to reduce the radiation exposure. Stalker 2's survival mechanics don't directly have anything wrong with them. You eat food and drink water to reduce hunger. This is fine and works intended in game. It's very simplistic in its implementation. I mean, Fallout 4 did the exact same thing with its survival mode back in 2016, so there isn't anything fundamentally new going on here, but that's not necessarily a bad thing by any means. The problem I have with the whole survival system in Stalker 2 is that due to the abundance of loot and supplies that you find in-game, the system fails to actually deliver any level of challenge or difficulty or satisfaction, and becomes more like a chore to just open your bag and eat 5 pieces of bread every 10 minutes. The day-night cycle is so short in Stalker 2, with each in-game minute that passes being equivalent to around 2.5 seconds IRL, so a full day-night cycle takes around an hour of real-life time, meaning that you only get about 20 minutes of proper daylight in-game each day. Because of this and the way the food system works, Skiff starts to get hungry approximately every 4 to 6 hours, meaning every 5 or 10 minutes you need to eat food because so much time has passed in game. I would much rather have the day-night cycle extended significantly to make it so that eating a large meal in game means the player is actually satiated for a good hour or so of gameplay, provided you don't do anything to increase hunger. Speaking of which, energy drinks for some reason increase your hunger level, meaning you have to eat more often, and with how often you need to consume energy drinks to run anywhere in this game, it feels like I'm opening my bag every few minutes to eat food. I don't know about you, but drinking energy drinks in real life doesn't make me hungry, rather the opposite happens. Caffeine is actually an appetite suppressant, so this really should be working the other way around in game. Due to the overabundance of food, you never actually need to plan out your next trip into the zone and work out how much food you should take with you. I remember playing Stalker Gamma and spending time at my base cooking food and preparing meals to take into the zone with me on my next trip, because you basically never find edible food out in the wild, and any food you do find is contaminated with radiation, making the player choose between dealing with hunger or radiation debuffs. I don't want to make too many comparisons between Gamma and Stalker 2 because they are very different games, but I think comparing how these two mechanics work is fair. I never need to think about the survival system in Stalker 2 because the zone has such an abundance of food that I'm never going to run out or be in any risk of going hungry. I can just knife a few crates and find enough supplies to feed a small village. Let's talk about the sleep mechanic in Stalker 2. Because yes, believe it or not, there is a sleep mechanic in this game and Skiff does actually get tired, but you would never know this because energy drinks directly restore your fatigue meter, so if you drink enough energy drinks, then bam, you never need to sleep. In my 60-hour playthrough, I only ever had to actually sleep due to fatigue once. Once in 60 hours of playtime. And the reason for this is the energy drinks and how they work. If they didn't restore your sleep meter, then sleeping would be an often occurrence, as it should be. But since the stamina and sprint meter is so low in this game, you need to pound back a heart attack's worth of energy drinks just to run a half mile to your next objective. And the thought I kept getting while playing this game was just thinking, did no one test this? Did no one play the game with this system and think, yeah, this is working fine? It's like every mechanic in this game is just a bare minimum implementation of what it could be to be called a game mechanic. I'd rather just not have any survival mechanics at all than having to deal with this repetitive bullshit. You can choose to optionally sleep if you want to skip nighttime, which I would highly recommend because exploring at nighttime is just straight up worse than daytime. The headlamp you have has a really short range, enemy vision or accuracy isn't affected at all, and there's no option for any form of night vision in the game, which for a AAA open world shooter with daylight cycles to release without any form of night vision is genuinely baffling. I do not understand why this wasn't in the game at release. It's been data mined from the game files that there is night vision goggles in the game, and NPC character models have night vision goggles as well, leading me to assume this was a last minute cut feature of the game, probably because it didn't work with the lighting model correctly. I'm pretty confident that night vision and binoculars will be added into the game at some point, but for it to be missing from the game even now is really disappointing and leaves the nighttime exploration lacking severely. Okay, I've complained enough about the weapons and survival mechanics, so let's talk about the economy and reward system in Stalker 2. The economy system in Stalker 2 is fairly straightforward like most other games of its kind. You do missions, and those missions reward you with coupons, a digital currency unique to the zone created by the Freedom faction. Selling items to traders also gives coupons, and those coupons are used to buy supplies and gear, upgrade and repair gear, and fast travel using guides around the zone. The problem with Stalker 2's economy is that it's not really weighted in your favour. Missions reward you with very little coupons, and whilst the devs did increase the rewards from missions, it's still not enough. And selling gear and supplies you don't need does not yield you very many coupons either, unless it's either very high-end gear or armour, much of which are unique items that can't be obtained again. Artifacts do sell for a fairly good price to most vendors, but the time it takes to farm artifacts actually makes farming them quite a slow way to make money in the game. And the sell price of artifacts is very low for 1, how rare the artifact is, and 2, for how much time it takes to farm up a decent amount of artifacts. The only way to make any considerable money from artifacts is doing the side quests to hand in an artifact to a trader. These quests are good to make some coupons, but the required artifact is only revealed to you after accepting the quest, so you might accept one of these quests and not find the artifact for hours and hours of playtime. If the quests showed the type of artifact needed before accepting the quest, it would be much more appealing and a solid way of making some quick cash in the zone. The problems continue with how much things cost in Stalker 2. Weapons and supplies are not too bad, to be fair. I think supplies and meds should be expensive to buy in the zone because they should be a scarce resource in high demand by literally everyone, so high prices would naturally reflect that. The biggest expense in the game, and likely what most of your coupons will be spent on though, is repairing your gear. Weapon and armor repair costs are extortionately expensive in this game. Especially once you get some endgame gear like exoskeletons and high-end guns, the repair cost skyrockets to the point where doing a run into the zone or doing a couple of missions will actually very often lose you money once you pay the costs to repair your gear. Especially if you take a lot of damage to your armor, which is by far the most expensive thing to repair in the game. Armor and weapons degrade very quickly, with many weapons losing up to 10% durability after just a couple of magazines fired out of the gun. In the background footage for this section, I'm exploring around Jupiter, mainly hunting for artifacts. I went on a 30-minute excursion, leaving Yaniv Station and making my way up through Jupiter to the border of Pripyat. I encountered a couple groups of mutants, a squad of ward soldiers, and later a squad of military. From fighting these groups, my vector degraded by over 35%, and that, combined with the durability drop of my ASPB pistol, my armor set, and my M701 sniper, the repair costs were almost 30,000 coupons for a 30-minute run where I encountered maybe 20 to 30 enemies in total. The repair system being this expensive makes it prohibitively difficult to keep a gear set properly maintained and drains your coupons every time you go on a run into the zone. The repair cost either needs to be tuned way down or have some kind of goodwill system where doing quests and missions for a certain faction will earn you a discount at that faction's technician, making it cheaper to repair and upgrade your gear with them. Or there need to be some items implemented that allow the player to repair their own gear while out in the zone, items like cleaning kits or gun oils that could quickly allow the player to keep their weapons maintained in the field. With how quickly some weapons lose durability, I don't want to be in the middle of a run in the zone or doing some missions and have my gun start jamming just because I fired a few mags through it. Skiff is shown in-game to be very proficient with his knowledge and handling of weapons, supposedly serving in the Ukrainian Marine Corps. You would think he would be able to maintain and clean a weapon of his whilst out in the zone, providing he had the right tools to do so. Hopefully we'll see something like this added in a future update, and there is already a mod that allows items like this to be bought from traders. The economy in Stalker 2 is fairly broken and makes the game feel unfair and overly punishing for just playing the game, knowing that wearing good armor and using good weapons is going to slowly bankrupt you, and the way the enemies are balanced make it so you have to use the best weapons and armor in the game just to stand a chance against many enemies once you get further into the game. It just feels like it's weighted in the wrong direction, and there are so many things that can be done to improve the way the repair system works, which would in turn fix most of the issues with the game's economy. Moving on to enemy balancing, and boy is this a rough subject to cover in Stalker 2. The enemy balancing in Stalker 2 is kind of all over the place. Some enemies are very squishy early game like bandits, requiring only basic weapons to easily take them out, providing you hit headshots. Body shots seem to do very little damage even if you hit center mass in the chest, with even basic bandits in leather jackets and bandit armor needing 4 or 5 shots from an AK to take them out, which is insane that even a basic leather jacket or bandit armor provides enough protection to stop that many shots to the torso. The enemy balancing in the early game for human enemies I don't really have any particular problems with. The AI feels competent enough to play against, and squads will try and perform maneuvers to flank you, throw grenades, hold cover in defensive positions. It all works together pretty well and makes for a fairly satisfying combat experience when everything is working correctly. The only complaints I do have about the AI is that 1, the enemy accuracy is fucking cracked in this game. Enemies pretty much never miss you. Even at extreme distances, they will still hit over 90% of their shots. Even from terribly inaccurate weapons like shotguns, pistols and SMGs, you just get repeatedly peppered over and over again by enemies, which is especially apparent when running away between cover, trying to run away from firefights, or just getting aggroed to enemies that are just in the distance and they just spot you instantly, and then you'll just get fucking peppered by them. Weapon recoil is pretty high in Stalker 2, even when using fully upgraded weapons, with full auto only really being viable inside of about 20 meters. Anything over that and you'll be needing 2 to 3 shot bursts or just single fire to effectively engage any enemies. However, the enemies you encounter don't seem to have any recoil effects. Most enemies are capable of shooting full auto at any distance and still hitting the majority of their shots, making engaging enemies at distances very difficult to do, combined with the high amount of aim punch. In my opinion, the enemy accuracy needs to be reworked entirely to closer simulate the player experience, which would in turn lead to a more balanced combat system. Secondly, the AI has the same level of sophistication for every enemy in the game, so your pleb bandit hanging around in Cordon is as good of a sharpshooter as a monolith super soldier in Pripyat. This kind of cheapens the combat experience because every enemy behaves the same way and doesn't make enemies feel any more difficult because of their behaviour. Instead, the enemies only become more difficult due to their equipment and their weapons. I remember playing the original trilogy and encountering Master or Legend level Stalkers and having to be much more careful about how I engaged those enemies because their weapon accuracy and recoil management was much better than the average Stalker, meaning they could melt you quickly if you made any rookie mistakes, and that whole system is gone in Stalker 2. Mutants are still unreasonably tanky in a lot of cases early game, especially boars, flesh and bloodsuckers, requiring a lot of shots to kill, which given how common they seem to be can be a real annoyance in the early to mid game. But once you get a decent shotgun like the M860 or the S.T.A.L.K.E.R, these mutants are pretty easy to handle. I do just want to quickly say that bloodsuckers and other rarer mutant types feel far too common in the open world. Bloodsuckers in particular feel about as common as finding boars and pseudo-dogs. In the original trilogy, bloodsuckers were a rare and terrifying mutant that was so scary and foreboding because of their rarity. You didn't see them very often at all, so when you did hear that spine-tingling roar, they scared the shit out of you. Compare this to Stalker 2, and bloodsuckers now just feel like another run-of-the-mill mutant to kill. The element of horror these mutants once held for me has completely vanished. Also, on a side note, Psydogs are bullshit. They make way too many copies of themselves, and unlike the previous games, there's no way to tell the true Psydog from all of the copies, and there's a lot of copies. I don't actually think there's any limit in the base game as to how many copies they can make, making them hands down the most annoying enemy mutant to deal with in this game, to the point where if I see one now, I just give up and run away. Once you get past the early game and move on to the later game areas, especially after finishing up the missions at S.T.A.L.K.E.R, the game ramps up in difficulty significantly, with most enemies who aren't bandits now wearing heavy armor, and you'll see significantly more exosuits, at least 1 or 2 per squad in my experience. These tougher enemies require you to use high penetration weapons or AP ammo to kill them reliably. If you don't, these enemies will require a large number of shots to kill with just FMJ, even when using a high-end assault rifle like the Karod or the Dnipro. This wouldn't be a problem if AP ammo was more available than it currently is. You can buy it from vendors and you'll find a decent supply of it out in the open world, but when most NPC encounters now require AP ammo to be handled effectively, your stash of ammo will be quickly used up, especially on main missions where you go through gauntlets of enemies and objectives with no option to leave or resupply from your stash. I've had many such instances where I simply ran out of ammo during main missions, despite bringing well over 300 rounds of ammo with me. The later game enemies are especially tanky, even when using the highest tier weapons in the game. This balance of the enemy gear makes all of these endgame enemies incredibly tanky and very tough to kill, even with the best weapons in the game. The only weapons I found to be really effective were the Gauss rifle, AP sniper ammo, and explosives. Grenade launchers and RPG rounds seemingly ignore armor in Stalker 2, so they work very effectively as well. AP ammo from regular assault rifles does work well against these enemies, provided you're using the Carrod or Dnipro and you're hitting headshots, but again, the amount of AP ammo you find versus the commonality of these enemies does not make for a good balance most of the time. Exoskeletons should be really tough to fight against, and they feel like they're in the right place balance-wise at the moment, but the amount of them that spawn in squads and groups needs to be dialed back so they feel more like a mini-boss enemy to fight rather than just a regular foot soldier wearing an Iron Man suit. Stalker 2 doesn't really tell you this, but mutants in the game do have an armor stat like human enemies, so to efficiently take down high tier mutants, AP ammo is also the most effective, rendering the expansive ammunition types mostly useless unless fighting low tier mutants like flesh, dogs and boars. Again, from a balancing perspective, the penetration stat is the most important stat in the game, and the mutants especially are balanced in such a way where if you're not using an appropriately penetrating weapon, high tier mutants are basically invulnerable. Pseudo-giants are even worse, and having the mutants function in this way and with no reward whatsoever for killing them, it just makes it better to run away in 90% of cases and not engage these enemies at all. The only time I do fight these mutants is when they're in a gated story mission area where you have to take them out. There's been a lot of talk online and on Reddit about the concept of mutant skinning and mutant loot, and I do agree that there should be some sort of reward in the game for taking down these high tier mutants. I acknowledge that mutant skinning was not in the previous games, but it works so well in mods like Gamma, and it could be implemented in a great way in Stalker 2. Even just being able to skin the pelts to use in artifact slots to give you certain bonuses, or have a trophy system like in The Witcher 3 and be able to exchange those trophies for coupons would work fantastically. I think even the devs considered this at some point or another, as we can see in Rostock there is a suspiciously empty vendor stall with mutant heads and pelts on the walls, and I reckon there was going to be some kind of NPC that trades in mutant parts. Maybe we'll see this in a future update or DLC, but right now that stall is remaining empty. Another issue I encountered while exploring the zone, especially after the A-Life updates that increased the amount of spawns, is just how difficult it is to tell what factions some enemies are. A lot of stalkers in the zone use pretty similar looking armor sets, and with the faction colours for each armor being pretty subtle and very desaturated in Stalker 2 compared to the previous entries in the series, this being especially true for exoskeletons, it makes telling enemies and friends apart pretty damn difficult, particularly at night time, and having no faction identification system or binoculars like in the previous games makes this problem even more apparent. I've had so many instances where I've accidentally opened fire on Freedom or Duty soldiers thinking they're another faction because it's so difficult to tell them apart at range, which has meant a lot of quick saves and quick loads because I don't want to get into gunfights with friendly factions and ruin my reputation with them. The only factions that are pretty easy to tell apart is Ward and Monolith, which is good because they are the main antagonists of the game based on which choices you make in the story. The other issue is the range and speed of how quickly enemies aggro to you when out in the zone. I've had so many instances where the little white detection indicator pops up showing an enemy is aggroing to me, only to look for where they are and they're almost 100 meters away, and then because of how broken the enemy accuracy is in the current version, the whole squad just starts shooting at you from that distance, hitting the majority of their shots, and it's so obnoxious that you just have to run away until they lose aggro, or you're going to shred your armor and then have to pay 10k coupons to go and repair it. So much of the basic gameplay loop in Stalker 2 is just frustrating because of the current way things work in the game. Exploring the zone should be the most fun part of the game on par with the main story, and more often than not it just feels like a chore to go out exploring and it's rarely worth it financially to do so. A-Life was an artificial intelligence behavioural management system created by GSC for the original Stalker trilogy. A-Life is essentially a real-time simulation of the zone and all of its entities, treating each individual stalker, each mutant, as its own entity with its own stats, location, missions, loadouts, etc. NPCs aren't simply spawned in like other games, but have a real-time location that the game keeps track of in the back end. For example, say you accept a mission to track down and kill a certain stalker, you get given a quest marker to their location, and provided you're in the same area as they are, you can actually watch them move around on your PDA in real time, because the game doesn't just spawn in that enemy when you approach the quest area, but that enemy is a real entity that is being managed by A-Life. When Shadow of Chernobyl released in 2007, the A-Life system was amongst the most advanced AI management systems of any game on the market, and alongside the other game's features and its general setting, A-Life is what cemented Stalker in the hearts of many fans. It was a real standout feature of the original trilogy and is the main thing that keeps me coming back to the original games and mods like Gamma and Anomaly, because no other open world FPS game I've played has come close to replicating the A-Life system and how goddamn good it is. It made the zone feel alive and made it feel like you are not the main character here. You are just another stalker in the zone. Things happen around you without your interaction, factions will fight over locations, kill mutants, fight other patrols, loot locations, hunt for artifacts, and this all happens in a natural way that truly makes the zone feel alive in a way that I've not really experienced in any other open world game since. Stalker 2, at least in its current state at the time of this video, has scrapped this system in its entirety, instead opting for a supposedly new and improved A-Life 2.0 system, which mysteriously disappeared from the game page on Steam the day before the game released. A-Life 2.0 was supposed to be the successor to the original system, with more advanced interactions, being able to function in an open world setting, but none of this is true, at least not at the moment. The AI system in Stalker 2 works closer to other open world games like Far Cry. To put it simply, there is a bubble around the player with a radius of 80 to 100 meters. Within this bubble, certain spawn scenarios can randomly trigger based on the location and progress in the game that will spawn enemies or allies around the player. This effectively simulates things happening in the zone and around the player, even though in reality they don't. As soon as those enemies leave your 80 meter radius bubble, they will quickly be despawned to save on resources unless they are in direct combat with you. This system, or at least the way it's being implemented right now, completely breaks the game for me. The entire system of how the old games worked has been thrown out, I would assume for performance reasons, as trying to replicate A-Life 1.0 on an open world scale in a game as large as Stalker 2 would be extremely resource intensive. But if that's the case, why did the devs openly lie about it being in the game for so long? With the current system, spawns feel overly fake and don't make much logical sense from a gameplay perspective. The scenarios are not very well put together and often results in sudden gunfights happening because enemies spawned only 20 to 30 meters away from you, just out of sight or around corners in buildings. Enemies respawn very quickly around points of interest. I've cleared out so many areas of enemies only to come back after selling off my loot at the nearest trader, and all of the enemies have respawned as if nothing had happened. Enemy factions don't fight over locations or take and hold any ground in the zone like they used to. The spawn scenarios with mutants really highlight how little thought went into this current system. The number of times that I've had multiple bloodsuckers spawn around me, even during daytime, is staggering. Not just 1 or 2, but 3, 4, or even sometimes 5 bloodsucker spawns is ridiculous, and the spawns in general, especially for mutants, needs to be toned down significantly. The human enemies I don't mind so much. Encountering patrols of freedom or mercs is fine. I don't really have a problem with how it works, but it just feels cheap and fake, especially when compared to the old games, and that's because it is. It's an illusion of how A-Life worked in the previous games. There's no weight to any of the counters, it all feels empty and void of any interaction. In the original trilogy, say for example you take out a squad of mercenaries that are holding a point of interest. Once you take them out, you've created a power void in that particular area, and another faction squad could pass by and decide to claim that area for themselves, so the next time you go past there could be duty there instead, making your actions have weight and consequences in the game. I remember playing Call of Pripyat, and you could often find roaming squads of stalkers around the zone, and you could ask to just tag along with them, and you could go around the zone together killing mutants or hunting artifacts. That is absent in Stalker 2, and while the random encounters do fill the voids of empty space between points of interest, it just doesn't feel the same, and if you can't see the stark difference between the two, then I'm sorry, but you need to go back and play Shadow of Chernobyl again because the difference is staggering. The devs have made some improvements to the current system in the latest patches for the game, but all that's really been done is the spawn radius has been increased and the random trigger for spawns has also been increased, with the effect being that you'll encounter more spawns of enemies more frequently and at a slightly longer range than before. But we are still a long way off from being anything close to the original A-Life system. It's much more difficult to effectively plan around locations or use stealth in Stalker 2, because at any moment in the open world something can just spawn near you or behind you that no amount of recon or planning could have foreseen because it just appears out of thin air. There have been plenty of occasions in Stalker 2 where I've surveyed a point of interest and tried to be tactical with my approach to clear out a group of monolith or bandit or ward soldiers, only to have a random spawn of boars or bloodsuckers appear 40 meters away, aggro onto me instantly and give away my position, and it's beyond frustrating because there's no way you can plan against that from happening to you. I sincerely hope that GSC finds a way to restore the current A-Life system back to its former glory, but in its current state with the performance and optimization of the game, it will be a long time before this happens, and the current state of the AI spawns in Stalker 2 is the main reason I have stopped playing the game for now. As we get to the end of this video, I've written a lot of conclusions to this clusterfuck of a review, and none of them have felt right, so I'm just going to wing it. Despite all that I've said during this video, I do like Stalker 2. I can see the vision the devs had for this game, and I don't think the issues the game has is from any kind of malicious intent by the devs. This wasn't some Ubisoft cash grab with shoehorned in microtransactions and weapon skins to make your AK look like a dragon. The devs genuinely wanted to make a good game, and in my opinion, they've released what is the foundation of a good game. You can see that this game has been made with passion, that the devs loved the Stalker series and truly wanted to give us the sequel we've all been waiting so long for. Did it miss the mark? Yes, it did. Will things be fixed? I do believe so. I wanted to make this video to offer constructive criticism on the game in its current state. Stalker 2 is a game that needed more time to be developed. It's clear to most of the player base that it is neither perfect nor finished. There's a good chance that in 2 to 3 years time, this video will be obsolete, and I'm praying that will be the case. I really want to love this game. There's a part of me that does love this game, but there's an equal part of me that wishes I just refunded it, saved my money, and waited for the issues to be fixed. But here we are, 80 hours later in the game, and I wouldn't say that my money has been wasted, but there are other games that give you better value for money right now. Can I recommend you buy Stalker 2 right now? With all my heart, no. I cannot in good conscience recommend this game given the issues it's currently facing, but watch this space, and I guarantee you that answer will change. Will it change tomorrow? Unlikely. But the Stalker community is one of the most dedicated gaming communities I've ever seen, and given time, this game will be one of the best open world FPS games that money can buy.